Welcome to the voices of transparency and excellence. We're not pivoting. The world is spinning like a top. Let's stop, figure things out, get some answers. Come with us on this ride. Warm regards, Rick and Judi.
Welcome to our podcast series where we address crucial topics impacting our campus and community. I'm Judi Clarke, and I'm here with...
And I'm Rick Gatteau, and in today's episode, we're going to be discussing the impacts of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act passed by Congress and signed into law by President Trump on July 4th of this year. We are joined by and thrilled to welcome Stony Kelton, Professor of Economics and Public Policy, and the Interim Dean of the School of Communication and Journalism here at Stony Brook University. Stony, it's a pleasure to meet you, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Nice to be with you. Thank you.
Great. So it has now been about 3 months since President Trump signed the bill into law. And I'm wondering if you could share, since there's a lot to unpack here today, what are some of the highlights of the bill that was passed?
Well, okay, highlights, lowlights, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. After all, it's called the Big Beautiful Bill, but not everybody agrees it's so beautiful. So we're talking about a piece of legislation that is massive, sweeping. Okay, the legislation itself was some 870 pages. I'll admit that I did not read 870 pages of legislation, but I can tell you what some of the highlights or lowlights, depending on one's point of view. So the biggest thing maybe in the legislation is just an extension of the tax cuts that were passed in 2017, sometimes called the Trump tax cuts. So in a lot of ways, it's a continuation of what has already been in place in terms of tax policy for the better part of a decade. So that doesn't feel like something new, right? In sheer dollar terms, it's why people call it the big bill, because it kind of implies that there's a large price tag attached to it. But again, a continuation of what we've already been doing. And then there are some new bells and whistles on the tax side, new incentives and deductions for businesses, taking away some deductions and support on the tax side for clean energy investments and things like that. Accounts for newborn children, called these so-called Trump sort of baby accounts, which is like a little savings account. Everybody gets a trust fund sort of thing. It's a little account for newborn babies. No tax on tips, no tax on overtime, some breaks for seniors on the tax side. So there's a tax piece. And then there's what's happening on the spending side. And there are some really big changes, almost $1 trillion in cuts over the next decade to Medicaid, about $280 billion in cuts to nutrition support, the so-called SNAP program, which provides food assistance to low-income families. That's some of the bigger points in the legislation. I mean, there's a lot in there, but I'd say those are many of the kind of front of mind sort of things.
So one of the things that is top of mind, particularly in higher education, is workforce readiness, making sure that our students are prepared, and impacts on students. Do you have any insight as to how the One Big Beautiful Bill may have any impact on our students?
Yeah, I mean, there are provisions in the legislation around things like income-based repayments. So once you borrow to attend college, there are certain rules that have been in place that allow somebody to, repay principal and interest over some period of time, but not have this thing hang around your neck for the duration of your entire life and you go to the grave with your student debt, that at some point you pay back student loans and then the rest of it is forgiven. There are programs out there to enable that. And some of what's in the One Big Beautiful Bill makes that more difficult and steers students into private services to help them, quote unquote, continue to repay loans. So stingier, in other words. Caps, more stringent caps on how much money can be borrowed to attend college and universities, which, depending on where you're trying to go and what you're trying to get a degree in can be make the difference between someone having an opportunity to go to med school or law school and somebody being shut out of that opportunity.
And now that we're 3 months in to the legislation passing, can you talk a bit about what effects you're seeing? Because you talked about highlights and lowlights. What are we seeing out in the public in terms of reaction and effects of the new law?
A lot of what you're seeing in terms of reaction is a reaction to what's coming down the pike as opposed to impacts that are currently being felt. It's what everybody knows is coming that's getting a lot of attention, especially around the cuts to Medicaid. So state and local governments are starting to panic in many cases because they understand that what's going to happen is that roughly half of the costs, so think half of $900 billion or so, those costs are going to be shifted from the federal government to state governments and local governments. So starting to see a lot of concern there around providing care for people, elder care, general health care. Rural hospitals, how many rural hospitals are going to shutter, potentially be forced to close, and there won't be care available for many people in large areas of the country. On the tax side, until you file your taxes, you don't feel a lot of that. Businesses are able to take advantage of some of the deductions. So if you're making large investments, you can very quickly expense those. You can write off 100% of the investment. So businesses are feeling the benefits of some of the provisions in the legislation. But a lot of it is being phased in over time. And so those cuts are coming. But in terms of the real pain that people are going to feel, a lot of that just hasn't happened yet. So people are still, I think, not really appreciating the magnitude of the cuts and what's coming down the pike.
And I think that's what's most important is a lot of these are scheduled to happen after the midterm elections. And really, when you talk about the impact, particularly to poor individuals, when you think about the SNAP program, and it covers just so many pieces related to nutrition and some of the health and welfare of our children, not to mention a rural hospital, which Stony Brook would be considered a rural hospital. Those cuts, can you just talk a little bit about what those cuts will look like in action, particularly around what is covered, what's not covered, and who's eligible?
Well, I can try, and you should step in because this is more your world than it is really mine as an economist. I mean, as I understand it, hospitals will be really challenged in terms of everything from just the reimbursement rates, how you're going to care for patients in the emergency room. People who are in dire straits will still receive care, but this is about how many people are going to lose health insurance coverage. The Congressional Budget Office, CBO, which scores major legislation, said that as a result of the cuts to Medicaid and some of the other provisions in the One Big Beautiful Bill, about 10 million people, Americans, will lose their health insurance coverage. If you add to that some of the other policy changes that are taking place that have to do with withdrawing the expanded support for people who get their health care through so-called Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act, you add another 5 million, so as many as 15 million people who are today insured losing their health insurance coverage, hospitals, rural hospitals, not receiving the same support in terms of reimbursement rates. And so it just becomes a matter of how do hospitals themselves make the numbers work, because they've got to pay staff, they've got to pay for facilities and the rest of it.
And a follow-up to that is the effect for states and local municipalities to cover where they're not receiving these federal dollars, or these federal cuts then put the ownership on states and local municipalities. Can you talk a little bit about the economics of what it will look like in towns or even from a state perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost unimaginable, the strain that this will place on state and local budgets. So what I understand, and not having, my feet on the ground in 50 states and the territories, but what I understand is that To some extent, states are really not quite there yet in terms of figuring out how they're going to respond to this. Maybe it's sort of wishful thinking that somehow this is going to be partially unwound and it's not going to be as bad as many have warned. But those states that are beginning to think hard about this are looking at everything from stress testing their budgets. What do you do in a different scenarios, right? Worst case scenario, least worst scenario, and how do you figure out how to prioritize when you have limited resources? How do you continue to provide care for people? And where do you make cuts? I mean, that's what it comes down to, right? So they're going to have to take a really hard look and figure out where can they pull resources from other areas in order to plug these holes. And are there things they can do on the revenue side to replace some of the lost federal support? And I think states are starting to look at all of those options.
In terms of a SNAP and Medicaid, do you think the impact will be gradually felt, or will it happen in a sense all at once? What's your sense in terms of timing of that?
A little bit of each. Some things will quickly change, and people will begin to feel the impacts really quickly. Probably around SNAP. More quickly, although that's also phased in. Those cuts are phased in over time. But, there are other things that aren't part of the one big beautiful bill that are also taking place around healthcare that are scaling back the dollars that are available. And those people, we're talking about millions of people feeling the impact of that by the end of this year, if nothing is done. I mean, people have probably seen conversations around the shutdown and what's at stake. And what Democrats are trying to do is highlight some of the looming, imminent impacts around allowing the expanded support for people who get their health care through the Affordable Care Act. If that expanded support, those subsidies go away, some people are going to face hundreds or thousands of dollars of increased healthcare premiums per month. I mean, there are people who will be paying as much as $20,000 or more additional for their health insurance coverage per year. The numbers are astronomical. This is not something most families can bear.
So can you help us understand what the background on the advocacy for that particular part of the bill? Why? What was the impetus for putting that forward? And obviously, we know it just barely passed in both the House and the Senate. What's the impetus behind even wanting to move in that direction?
I wish I had a better memory of the way that the decision was arrived at. I can tell you that during COVID, in a pandemic, we were doing a lot of bold stuff. I mean, we really were. We expanded the child tax credit. We sent multiple rounds of stimulus checks to almost every person in the country. Congress was, in a sense, feeling a little generous in that moment. And after all, it was a health pandemic. And we wanted to make sure that people were covered, that people were able to stay in their jobs and in their homes or apartments. I mean, we did all kinds of things, a moratorium on foreclosures. There was a lot going on in that period. And expanding these subsidies just made it possible for millions of people to sort of make the Affordable Care Act more affordable, to put the affordable in the Affordable Care Act. And so it was an enormous change. It really did beef up. If anybody's ever gone on to the websites and shopped for health insurance under the exchanges, you see the bronze and the silver and the gold and platinum plans. I used to have my students do an exercise, and I'd say, if your income is within this range, go and shop these different plans and figure out how much support you would get. And after the change, it was incredible how much more generous the support became. So what's at stake for all these people who would see those premiums spike, again, is rather unimaginable. If you're trying to manage a household budget, it's a shock and a hit that I don't know how most families will bear it.
So speaking of the economy, what will be really interesting from a local perspective, we think about local businesses, small businesses, you think about it from a state and local perspective, irrespective if you're like a Fortune 500 company or not, people won't have discretionary dollars. How, after the full onset of the One Big Beautiful Bill, And we understand how it affects businesses, but we're talking about consumers. How will this lack of discretionary dollars affect our economy?
Well, our economy runs on sales. I mean, I sometimes tell my students, capitalism runs on sales. This is a capitalist economy. It is driven by the consumer. Consumer spending accounts for about 70% of all spending in the economy. So if you tell a household that, $800 more a month is going to have to go to your health insurance coverage, well, that's $800 that can't go chasing after other things. So what do you cut? Maybe you don't pay the babysitter because you're not going to go out and see, a movie and have dinner on date night with your spouse one night a week. Maybe you cut the cable. Maybe you drop some subscriptions for Disney Plus or Netflix or whatever the case may be, right? You're cutting back on discretionary spending, I would imagine, very significantly. And every dollar that somebody doesn't spend on one of those things is a dollar that's then not captured by the business that is providing those goods and services. And so there's a spiral effect, right? A domino effect where one person's spending is another person's income. People start reducing the amount they spend on a whole array of goods and services, and that has a very depressing effect on the economy as a whole.
One of the aspects of the bill that drew some criticism was around, and you mentioned about the Congressional Budget Office, that there was a prediction that the bill as passed would add $3.3 trillion to the national debt after 10 years. And what if you could comment on that? Because that seemed to be a big point of discussion at the time of debate.
Well, I can comment on it. I don't think I actually mentioned the budgetary impacts of the bill because those are, for me, the least relevant of anything we could have in the discussion. When the legislation was being drafted, and there was a House version, and then, of course, the Senate had its turn, and we got a bill eventually that was a compromise between the two. And when I mentioned the size of the bill, the price tag, right? A lot of attention was paid to how is it going to impact the fiscal picture? How is it going to impact the deficit or the debt? And I really believe strongly that the focus should have been and should be now, how is it going to impact people? How is it going to impact communities? How is it going to impact the economy? The budgetary stuff, I think, is mostly meant as a distraction. So I think that there's a belief that somehow the federal government's budget works like your own household budget. And so when people hear that the Congress has done something that's going to increase the deficit or add to the deficit, it automatically sounds irresponsible. People start focusing on the size of the number. And there's a lot of debate. And Republicans, of course, don't believe that they've actually done anything to increase the deficit. They'll tell you all of this stuff is so growth enhancing. The tax breaks will lead to an economy that's growing so rapidly that the government's going to end up with more money than it knows what to do with. The revenues will come pouring in. And this is the so-called trickle down story.
Sure.
Critics will say, no, it's going to add anywhere from 3.5 to maybe as much as $6 trillion to the deficit over time. Again, I think that's the wrong way to look at it. And I could go into an entirely different explanation about why that is. But just to put it in really simple, quick terms, the government deficit is how much money the government is adding to the non-government part of the economy. So if they're adding 3.5, $5 trillion, that's a minus on their ledger is a plus on our ledger. So in purely financial terms, this is good for someone. The question is, where is that financial surplus going? And I think we know the answer. It's that the extension of the tax cuts and new tax breaks overwhelmingly benefit large corporations and wealthier people.
So when you think about the vitality of a country, you think about it from military, you think about it from health and wellness, you think about its financial portfolio. So I wonder right now, how is this bill or how will this bill affect our relationships with other countries? And what do you think might be some broader scale impacts if there isn't a reinvestment with our allies, or it's more insulary to reinvesting into the nation prospectively? What are your thoughts?
That's a big question, Judi. And it's almost impossible to disentangle it from the other things that we're doing in terms of foreign policy and trade policy and everything else. So if I think hard about just what's in the one big beautiful bill, it's definitely, there are implications for the rest of the world. As we turn away from providing credits, the Inflation Reduction Act was the most ambitious piece of climate legislation ever passed. And that was passed by Democrats in the previous administration. The One Big Beautiful Bill unwinds a lot of what was in that. And that is bad for businesses that are in the industry of doing investments in R&D around green energy and clean tech. And so jobs and investments that were taking place, we had catalyzed a boom in green manufacturing in this country. That is mostly gone away. Now the focus is on fossil fuel again. And here there are obviously global implications because climate is a collective action problem. We need the whole world on the same page with respect to addressing the impacts of climate. And the U.S. is definitely off in a very different direction vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So there are implications for U.S. business interests as we withdraw support for investments in certain things and double down on investments in fossil fuel. And it's antagonistic to many countries in Europe who looked at that and said, what you're doing is undermining also our ability to export and to produce and to support industries in our own countries. And so.
And let me add on, since you've been just now talking about from a perspective of the world economy, can you talk a bit about the connection between the bill, then obviously a lot of focus on tariffs? And you talked about certainly Americans having discretionary income, knowing we're a consumer-driven society. How does that connect with tariffs and the impact on the buying power of the public, given who's going to ultimately pay for the tariffs?
So the tariffs are mostly being carried out at the executive level, right? The president wakes up and posts something on Truth Social or tweets something about what the new tariff rate will be for this country or that good or whatever the case may be, furniture one day, something else another day. So you're quite right. There is a very big debate about the tariffs and whether what are we actually trying to do with the tariffs? It's in the early stages, the argument was that this was going to help the U.S. become great again in the sense that we were going to bring back manufacturing jobs. And this was going to give rise to a whole new burgeoning industries and all of that sort of stuff. It was going to be a negotiating tool that allowed President Trump to say to other countries, you have to open your markets to our goods and services or do this or that. And we're going to use them as a negotiating tool, but they're not going to be permanent. It's just a short-term play. Then it was, it's going to bring in a lot of revenue. Maybe we'll even start to replace the income tax and we'll just have so much revenue from tariffs. Well, it can't be all of those things. If it's a temporary negotiating tool, then it is by definition temporary. If it's going to bring in revenue long-term for years to come, then they have to be permanent. And we know that when the tariffs are paid, a tariff is a tax. That tax is paid at the border as goods come in. So it is the importing country, that is the U.S., that pays the tariff. And then there is some, room for businesses to absorb some of that or pass some of that on to consumers. And that's what you're talking about. At the end of the day, how much is the consumer paying? And the answer is some of it. It's unclear at this point whether it's a third or a little more than a third, a little less than a third. Different businesses are making different decisions about how much to pass on, but a lot of revenue is coming in. And so we know that the tariffs are, quote unquote, working in the sense that they're generating a lot of revenue. Now you're starting to hear President Trump talk about maybe we're going to provide a refund. Maybe, we're going to send some of that money back to the people. And of course, we have to help the farmers because now the tariffs have really hurt U.S. producers, food producers, right? Agriculture. And so now, it's sort of like we're going to inflict a lot of pain on ourselves, end up with money, and then try to redress the problems by giving people some of the money back that for the damages we've caused. It's a very strange thing.
So interesting. The administration has a very strong interest in blockchain, cryptocurrency, and kind of these new economies. So when you think about it from an economic model, and you think about the direction it may go in or could go in, how do you see from our traditional economic models, how do you see the new introduction of blockchain or cryptocurrencies into some of these financial decisions?
I mean, blockchain is a technology,
Yeah.
right? Cryptocurrencies, man, that's another one where the story changes in the same kind of way that the narrative around tariffs has changed. First, they were supposed to be an alternative to fiat currency. The dollar is going to be done. Everybody's going to move, and we're all going to start transacting with Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. And this is how we're going to do our shopping and so forth. But the thing is so volatile that nobody would dream of parting with it to buy pizzas or whatever, because, it might be up $4,000 tomorrow and you've just given it away today. So it isn't a good medium of exchange. And so the story begins to change. Well, it's a store of value. Okay, maybe. I don't have a strong, clear picture on where I think things are headed. I think what I can say is we have an administration that is very crypto friendly,
Yeah.
and the laws are being changed in ways to be supportive of and encouraging of durability around crypto assets. Maybe some regulatory clarity that is helping. You have the traditional finance sector coming in now and wrapping its arms around this. You have things like stable coin. So it seems like the infrastructure is being built to make cryptocurrencies a presence in our financial ecosystem going forward. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think reasonable people can disagree. I have personally some concerns around that, but we'll see what happens.
Just one last question with us together today. We have the midterm elections just about a month away. Wondering, based on those elections, do you see anything changing at all in terms of we have the New York mayoral election happening, and anything that you think in terms of those potential changes of people in office would impact anything related to the bill that had been passed and some changes in some decision making potentially?
Oh, gosh. I mean, New York's the biggest city in the country, so that's definitely an important election. I think that depending on the outcome, and maybe a lot of people think that the outcome's pretty clear. I think a lot of people just think they know how that election's going to go. If we end up with a mayor, Zoran Mamdani, then I think one has to really do some soul searching and try to understand why someone with a platform that is, speaking to the needs of people, especially around affordability and an affordability crisis, how did that resonate with so many million people? Maybe it's not that much of a surprise that people in New York are concerned about the cost of housing and food and the rest of it. And to the extent that you can extrapolate from that to a broader conversation in the economy or the state, then I think there's the potential to see some more things along those lines, and maybe a change in the way that many Democrats approach their own policy platforms.
And absolutely, I think there's definitely a tide in how our voters, what their priorities are right now. And it'll be interesting to see the voters' voice as some of these things come into fruition, particularly those that are disenfranchised by some of the unintended consequences. Does that make a difference in our political landscape? Yep.
Well, Stephanie, I just wanted to thank you so much for your time today. The time goes by so quickly, but we really appreciate you sharing your insights and expertise with us today.
Absolutely. We hope our listeners find these discussions informative and empowering as we navigate these times. Thank you again to our guest, Stephanie, for your valuable contribution and scholarship.
And we hope you'll join us again, listeners, for next week's episode, where we're going to continue the conversation to understand the impacts of the one big, beautiful bill. For now, I'm Rick Gatteau.
And I'm Judi Brown Clarke. And thank you for checking in with us.